Guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we have a fun video where we're looking at Genesis. Whoops, there it is. We're looking at Genesis. Did Bible copy a bunch of older myths by Dan McClellan? He's reacting to a lady. But this is something that whenever I was researching the Bible and kind of going away from Christianity, these were a lot of things that were groundbreaking to me, earth-shattering, to be frank, because I was of the opinion that, the book of Genesis was this absolutely pure, holy, inspired book written by Moses without just putting a lot of thought to the actual mechanics of that. But a lot of people hold on to this idea that the book of Genesis is this perfect text that's written by Moses, and it's just not. It's just not. And so in this video, Dan McClellan, I don't know if you guys have ever heard, I've never reacted to his videos, but he's pretty instrumental in my confidence in walking away from Christianity. I tend not to do a lot of like the biblical scholar stuff, because at a certain point you just realize, you're like, oh yeah, this isn't it at all. This doesn't make any sense at all. And so then you just walk away from it and you just kind of don't ever turn back, right? And it's kind of the same thing here. So Dan McClellan, if I can give him kind of an intro, he's a biblical scholar. Let me just look this up really quick. And McClellan. So American biblical scholar. And you can find his stuff under Data Over Dogma. That's his YouTube channel, is Data Over Dogma. And he holds a PhD in theology and religion from the University of, I'm not even going to try to say that word, Exeter. Maybe I got that right. Maybe I butchered it. And a master's in Jewish studies from the University of Oxford, master's in biblical studies from Trinity Western University. Previously worked as a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, so he knows his stuff. He's a really informed individual, and so in this video, he's basically running us through the different stories in the Bible. Not all of them. He's just kind of, he's reacting to this specific video, and I'm not going to react too much because, like I said, I don't like doing these reaction inception videos where it's just a person reacting to a person reacting to a person. I typically don't like that, but there is solid, there's a lot of, this is a great video that he's put together that demonstrates that the Bible, this lady just makes a video that demonstrates that the Bible is just a compilation of stories and basically a rewriting of older stories that existed prior to the formation of the Bible. And he basically goes a little bit more in depth and explains things better than I ever could. And so please go follow his channel. His channel, once again, is Dan McClellan. It's just his name, Dan McClellan, and his kind of catchphrase. He has a podcast and all that kind of stuff. It's Data Over Dogma, but he completely goes through the Bible, and this is where whenever I was initially looking at the whole thing of homosexuality is an abomination to God and all this kind of stuff. He actually has a video on that, and he more accurately he explains that in the Bible that the homosexuality thing, right? That's an abomination to God. Obviously, homosexuality is not going to be written in the Bible. The word itself is not going to be in the Bible, but he basically states that it's more of a dynamic of a top or bottom kind of thing versus just the whole act of homosexuality, which that in of itself, this is what my church had a real problem with whenever I was a kid. Was I was saying, well, we should not be reading from the King James Version. We should be trying to get the most accurate version of the original of scripts that we can. And everybody was like, oh, John, you're headed down a very dangerous route and all that kind of stuff. And according to the religion, sure, I was heading down the dangerous route, because you should never study the Bible itself if you want to remain Christian and happily Christian. Just read the Bible and study the Bible, but don't actually study the Bible, right? Whenever people are walking away from Christianity, I always say, you can't find truth from inside of the perspective, right? If you're driving down the road and you have a check engine light that pops up on the dashboard inside of your vehicle, you don't try to diagnose the issue while you're still inside the vehicle. You have to stop the vehicle. You have to get out of the vehicle, pop the hood, and look at the vehicle, at the interior mechanics of the vehicle from the outside, if you even want to have a chance of understanding what's inside the vehicle and why the problem is even coming up, right? But the Christian thing to do is the check engine. I was having this argument with my dad, and he was like, well, you could just do what I do. Because my dad, we talk about this all the time. I don't hide this about myself to my family and stuff. But my dad, he goes, or you could do what I do. And I was like, what's that? He's like, you could just ignore the check engine light and pray that it goes away. And I was like, yeah. How's that working for you? He was like, well, it's still driving. I'm like, you better hope it's something stupid like O2 sensors or a catalytic converter or something like that. Anyways, with that being said, let's get into today's video.
Did you know that the Bible...
Really quick, guys, I've been uploading a bunch of new videos to my website, so you can see that down in the link in the description. I had a meeting. I was supposed to have a meeting recorded with a person who wanted to come on the show, and they're in New Zealand, and my brain absolutely butchered. I told him, I was like, okay, Sunday 2 p.m. and then for me that's Saturday Sunday 2 p.m. is Saturday 9 p.m. my time, something like that. But my brain just latched on to the Sunday at 2 p.m. and I was just like, okay, I'm going to be ready to do this thing at Sunday at 2 p.m. And then Sunday at 2 p.m. came, and I was just like, oh my God, it was last night, not today. So, but he's all the way in New Zealand, so that's kind of a this one's hard for me. It's not like it's a couple hours in either direction. Like he's a whole day into the future. It's kind of crazy. With that being said, down into the description, you'll see the link to my website. I have a bunch of videos there. I'm putting videos about how to forgive people, how to move forward from Christianity, how to forgive your people, like your old pastor and things like that, people who might have done stuff to you inside of the religious community and stuff, how to forgive and move on from that, what direction you should go from there, without pointing you in a specific direction. The purpose is not to say this is the right way to go, because ultimately it doesn't matter which direction you go. So what we do is we kind of point you down the path of internal understanding and self-discovery. That's kind of the whole purpose. So we take you out of Christianity and we put you inside of your own self and your own mind so that you can understand yourself and understand your belief systems, why you were susceptible to this, why you had this, why the desires of, having control, all these things came up for you, maybe why your relationships happened the way that they did, all that kind of stuff. So with that being said, all this stuff's on the website down below. There's a lot of programs. They're all free right now, so take advantage of them while they are free, because they're not going to be free for much longer. Once I finish up those programs, I'm probably going to close them off to where they're no longer free. But with that being said, also Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. Central, I have a live stream here on YouTube, and you can call in and I can support you with anything that you're dealing with in Christianity. It's best if you phone call in. I tend to get distracted with everybody putting their stuff in the chat, so I'm not going to lie, I have a bit of ADHD brain. And so if I see a chat while I'm talking about something, I'll absolutely get interrupted and my mind will go crazy. With that being said, let's get back to this.
Borrows a lot of stories from older ancient writings.
All right, let's see it.
Let's start with the story of Noah and the flood. There are older versions of this story, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Adrahasis. Same plot. just written down centuries before Genesis was. Basically, God floods the earth, a man builds a boat, he saves the animals, he sends out the birds. Again, that story existed hundreds of years before Genesis.
So just like the version of Genesis that we have today is a cobbling together of a variety of different traditions, including the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, the ancient Mesopotamian traditions are also a cobbling together and a passing down of shared traditions. And so they start with Sumerian king lists that date to the early 3rd millennium BCE that had no flood myth. And then later in the 3rd millennium BCE, you get a flood myth inserted into the king lists. And this flood myth later on enters a bunch of other texts. You have this Eridu Genesis text. Later on, you have Atrahasis, and then later on, you have the Gilgamesh epic, where the flood hero's name is Utnapishtim. And then it's probably a Neo-Babylonian version of this story that Judeans borrow. And they borrow it so that they can revise it, and so that they can appropriate it and turn it into something that better serves their own interests. And so it's kind of responding to and trying to supersede this widespread tradition by saying, no, here's how it actually happened, where there are still very clear points of contact, but they're also saying this is our version of this. We're making this a little bit different so that it actually promotes our interests and our identity. So if you would like more on this, David Carr's book, The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11, is a phenomenal start, and there's a lot of good bibliographic data in there if you'd like to track down other texts.
And then
So that basically, is in direct conflict with the kind of, I don't want to say the overwhelming Christian idea, but I know from a small town church congregation point of view, you have to remember that the small town church congregation is not going to be biblical scholars who go crazy with all this kind of stuff, right? As a Christian, I was very much just in the congregation. I didn't go to Bible college. My sister went to Bible college, and she decided that she would never send any of her kids to Bible college because she didn't want them to leave the faith. So, so with that being said, pardon me. With that being said, kind of the accepted idea is that Moses is the one who wrote the book of Genesis from a lot of these smaller churches, including the church that I grew up in. And so hearing this idea that the book of Genesis is not, a completely, written together, but it's actually a whole bunch of, what I was told was that it was written by Genesis and maybe there were other stories that were kind of brought together to make it make sense. Well, that's a really just a fast right over the top. You're not even going into any of it. If you have a lot of these older texts that are referencing different gods, that are referencing different deities, that are referencing different stories, throwing them all together and saying that Moses wrote them all together is just an absolute disgusting. It's just a disgusting misrepresentation of what the book of Genesis actually is. Now I kind of always hold the stance of, well, who the hell was actually there? So obviously God did not dictate word for word to Moses, because if that was the case, then the book of Genesis would be a 100% completely, new idea, or wouldn't share so many similarities with other significantly older texts than the book of Genesis itself, right? And so whenever you take apart the book of Genesis and you kind of put it under scrutiny, that's where you can really see that, okay, now the entirety of the Bible is under scrutiny, because the very, very foundational system, of course you have Jesus, you have Paul, you have all this kind of stuff. This is kind of like the main meat of Christianity, but it's built on the foundation of Genesis. And so if the foundation of Genesis is already cracked and broken, then everything else just falls apart. And that's what I experienced in my faith, was that, I was looking at, God was this, dictating to Moses. God was creating the entire planet in 7 days and all this stuff. And then you see all of these other writings, and you see that there's all of these things that don't make sense. And then on top of that, you get Moses, who's writing the book of Genesis, Moses, the same Moses who delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, who, to be frank, there's no significant source of archaeological data that supports the idea that there was this mass exodus from Egypt, because Egypt, with all of their record-keeping abilities, failed to mention these massive things that happened inside of Egypt, supposedly. And so, you take away the idea that Moses even existed, and you take away the idea that God dictated directly to Moses the book of Genesis. What you have is just a conglomeration of old stories of how the hell we got here. That's exactly what Moses is. It's just this conglomeration of old stories, and it's been doctored up to fit an agenda. So where do you go from there, right? If you're a Christian and you're just hearing this for the first time, it's just like, what the actual fuck? Well, if you're a Christian, you're probably not saying what the actual fuck. You're probably being like, what the actual freak? I used to say that. I would be like, well, freak you, dude. Because technically it wasn't cussing. But yeah. And so you get a lot of anger that kind of like builds up. I remember when I was walking away from Christianity, man, you get a lot of anger that kind of like builds up, but it's blind leading the blind, in a lot of situations when it comes to this kind of stuff, just because, the stories that we were taught, now that we're living in the age of information, where information is plentiful and a dime a dozen, and you're having to figure out for yourself, well, what actually reigns true. It's a bit different, right? It's just a bit different. So, anyways.
Laws in the book of Exodus look very similar to the Code of Hammurabi. Same structure, same type of rules, just written centuries before the book of Exodus was.
This is also accurate. And here we're talking specifically about the laws that we find in the covenant code, which primarily refers to Exodus 21 and 22, but it also covers the end of Exodus 20 and up to the middle of about Exodus 23. And on this, you're going to want to check out David Wright's book, Inventing God's Law, where David demonstrates pretty conclusively that the authors of the covenant code are drawing directly from the laws of Hammurabi. And they're even leaving a lot of things in the same order that we find them in the laws of Hammurabi. And
so
sometimes they switch up the order, sometimes they...
Sorry about that. My computer is glitching out for a little bit. Code of Hammurabi is a famous set of 282 legal rules created around 1754 BCE by King Hammurabi of Babylon, carved into a tall stone pillar. It's one of the oldest and most complete written law codes of human history, famously used the rule of an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The key facts about the code: punishments fit the crime, but they change based on person's social class. Society was split into three groups: elites, free people, and slaves. Daily life rules covered trade, prices, wages, marriage, and crime. And discovery found in 1901 on the Black Stone Pillar in modern-day Iran is now kept in the Laverne Museum. So just a little bit for those who don't know what that was.
They revise the laws. Sometimes they omit laws. And David goes through and discusses why they're making all the changes that they are making and why they're leaving some of the things the way that they left them. So this is another situation where very clearly the authors of these biblical texts are drawing from earlier texts that were written, in the case of the laws of Hammurabi, 1,000 years before the covenant code.
And then the book of Proverbs, parts of it closely mirrors an ancient Egyptian document called Amenenope.
This is also accurate. The book of Proverbs collects a bunch of different wisdom literature. That was a very popular genre in ancient Egypt and ancient Israel and ancient Mesopotamia. And there are a couple of dozen verses between around Proverbs 22:17 and 23:11 that are widely agreed to be directly borrowing from the instruction of Amenenope, which was originally written several hundred years earlier in Egypt, but the author is probably drawing from, if not a translation, some much later version of these instructions. But the order is the same, the style is the same, the themes are the same, the metaphors are the same, up to and including a reference to 30 sayings, maybe, in Proverbs 22:20, which might have reference to the fact that the instruction of Amenemope includes 30 chapters. So yes, this also indicates there is a relationship between what ended up in the book of Proverbs and existing literature that goes back hundreds of years from around West Asia and Northeast Africa.
So Amenemope, that's just a Egyptian wisdom text written around the Ramesses period. So it's just, kind of like we look at Proverbs. Proverbs, we kind of see it as like a wisdom text. But it's also another interesting reflection there is that, even parts of biblical wisdom are being drawn from parts of Egyptian wisdom that have nothing to do with God, right? Because Egyptian wisdom, they have their own sets of deities. They have their own sets of wisdom from, all these different deities that they had. They had a bunch of different deities. It's interesting to see how the Bible itself is just littered with all of these different texts, and it's not this completely pure, perfectly written document that so many Christians believe that it is. The book of Genesis is supposed to be this perfect document. The book of Exodus is supposed to be this perfect document, where it goes straight from God's mouth to the guy's hand. And that's what we're all taught, is that it went straight from God's mouth to the guy's hand who is writing out the Bible. And now we're finding out that it's more of just a collection of random texts, different wisdom texts, different storylines and things like that. Whenever we reference the flood, I talk about all the different cultures and all of their different flood myths, and all of their different stories surrounding that, right? And so it's very clear to see that, this idea that Christianity is like, it is the one true religion, is based off of the idea that this book is absolutely perfect in its writing, right? Now, whether it's still, referencing one single deity or anything like that, that's up for debate, but and not a debate that I'd be, good at explaining. Probably be better with Dan here, but yeah, it shows that there's a lot of chinks in the armor, that this isn't a perfect text like we've been sold that this was.
And then when we look at Moses as a baby put into a basket, that same story shows up earlier in another ancient writing called Sargon of Akkad. I hope I'm pronouncing this shit right. I only ever read about it. I don't ever hear about it.
That's well within the standard deviation of pronunciation. I usually say Sargon of Akkad, and this is also true. Now, our version of this myth comes from the second quarter of the first millennium BCE, so around the same time that the Moses tradition was probably developing, and there is debate about whether or not that tradition actually goes back to the third millennium Sargon of Akkad, or if it is...
Sorry about that, guys. There's a thunderstorm. I live away out in the woods, and so I'm using Starlink, and there's a thunderstorm, and so my internet kinds to get little, chicky and stuff. But with that being said, I wanted to reference Durante Lamar. He has a video called 7 Bible Characters That Never Existed, and how mythology... Am I going to be able to see the rest of that? Here, let me just click on it really quick.
Flood layer.
And I think we've done a reaction video to this a long time ago, but how mythology became history. That's the rest of that. There's no proof that Moses ever really existed, right? And that's very, very problematic, because whenever you start the whole biblical archaeology thing, if there were these big massive events like a mass exodus from Egypt, the firstborn of every single son in every household throughout the entire land of Egypt dying, you'd expect to see these things. You'd expect to see records of these things. And Durante basically goes through, and he just goes through and basically says, he presents the data on it. Durante's a really, really good at just presenting data. And so his channel and Dan's channel are really, really good for just straight data. But once again, it puts you in a state of, okay, well then what in the world do I believe? Because, a lot of people, they don't want to let go of Christianity because it's their comfort zone. It's what they grew up with. It's the belief system that they grew up with. It's the belief system that supports the idea of monogamy. It's the belief system that supports the idea that, if a person is a bad person, they're going to go to hell. And if a person's a good person, they're going to go to heaven. But at the same time, even that doesn't hold up to scrutiny because, a really incredibly horrible human being can accept Jesus one Mississippi before they die, and they're safe and they're in heaven now, right? So even the whole idea of this, divine justice and divine, this divine, justice doesn't really exist, right? So with that being said, let's get back to it.
Something that was created during Sargon II's life or reign, or if it came somewhere in between the two. So there's debate about when we can date the actual original tradition related to Sargon of Akkad, but the story of Moses is almost certainly borrowing directly from that tradition, and probably from the 8th or 7th century BCE, when the authors were cobbling together these traditions associated with Moses.
Then the creation story also sounds a lot like the story from Babylon called Enuma Elish. Same idea. Chaos, then order, then humans.
So this is another example where scholars are in very widespread agreement that the authors of Genesis 1 are definitely highlighting points of contact.
So really quick, just to give you an idea about the Sargon of Akkad. He reigned about 2300 to 2200 BCE, okay, for BCE and AD, all that kind of stuff. What it actually means, I don't know, but in my Christian school, I was taught that BC meant before Christ and AD meant after death. And then I found out that Jesus died in 33 to 30 AD, and then I was like, well, then my Christian school lied to me, and screw them. So it actually means something else, but I haven't gone to actually research what it means, and I don't remember, because I did once, but what's been drilled into me is that after death and before Christ. So it's kind of a crazy way of looking at history. But with that being said, so really quick about the Sargon of Akkad. We're just going to read this very briefly. According to the ancient legend, Sargon was the illegitimate son of a temple priestess who could not keep him. The river rescue, she placed him in a reed basket sealed with tar and set him afloat on the Euphrates River. The gardener, a water drawer and gardener named Akkad, found the baby, adopted him, and raised him. And the goddess Favor, the goddess Ishtar grew to love Sargon while he worked as a gardener, helping guide his path to greatness, rise to power. The royal cupbearer, Sargon eventually left the garden and secured a prestigious job as the royal cupbearer to King Ur-Zababa of Kish. Overthrown through political shifts and military success, Sargon transitioned from servant to ruler, seizing control after the fall or defeat of rival regional powers, conquest of Sumer. He defeated King, not going to try to say that word, who had previously united parts of Sumer and smashed the walls of major southern cities, building the First Empire. Sargon united the independent Sumerian city-states with the northern Semitic-speaking regions, establishing the Akkadian Empire. His military campaign stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Mediterranean Sea and parts of modern-day Iran and Turkey. He established a new capital of Akkad, or Akkad, the exact location which remains lost in modern archaeology today. So those are the similarities for that specific text that they were just referencing. So once again, for those who have no idea what these other texts are, I'm just going to kind of give you guys a little bit of an update what they are.
Contact with other traditions, including Enuma Elish, although here's where they're doing a lot more compositional legwork. They're not just borrowing something from other traditions. They're composing their own thing while also maintaining those little allusions to the other traditions as a way to say ours is better than theirs. But the chaos to order to humans trajectory is very common to all kinds of ancient creation accounts that are not necessarily genetically related. It's just kind of a classical trope that can develop on its own. Boy gets girl, loses girl, girl finds boy, boy forgets girl, boy remembers girl, girl dies in a blimp accident over the Orange Bowl. It's that classic old children's tale from the sea that we all know.
Then the book of Job. It's
that.
very similar to the writings in Mesopotamia that people sometimes call the Babylonian Job. I'm not going to try to pronounce this. Both wrestle with the suffering of a person who appears righteous.
So here the connections are a little fuzzier. There are a couple of different texts that are sometimes referred to as Babylonian Job, and they come from centuries before the composition of the book of Job that is in our Hebrew Bible. And it's
So that's going to be 1300 BCE.
likely that Job is actually drawing from kind of a shared sociocultural matrix rather than directly from one of these Akkadian texts. But the book of Job was probably written in the Persian period. It's probably influenced by literature that was in circulation at that time. And so it could have been from one of these texts that might be referred to by the Babylonian Job, or it just could be from, again, another shared tradition, another common literary trope that was just in the air in this time period.
So, really quick, Babylonian Job story. So, the hero is a loyal, pious official who follows the religious duty. Suddenly, the god Marduk turns away in anger. He loses his job, friends turn hostile, his family abandons him, and a horrific, painful illness takes over his body. The protagonist laments that human beings cannot... Okay, I need glasses. I'm sorry, guys. I can't. I'm doing my best over here. There it is. Now I can see. The protagonist laments that human beings cannot understand the ways or thoughts of the gods. Diviners, I guess, and magicians fail to heal him or explain his doom. In a sequence of vivid dreams, divine figures, including an incarnation priest and a radiant young woman, arrive to purify him and announce that his penance is finished, his health and standing are fully restored, and he offers a hymn of deep gratitude to Marduk. Key comparisons to the biblical book of Job. Both texts deal with a righteous person struck down by severe misfortune despite living a good life. Unlike the biblical book of Job, which tackles the philosophical problem of pain through intense debate, the Babylonian text functions primarily as a personal thanksgiving hymn celebrating divine mercy after a miraculous healing. That's what that's all about.
Even the Garden of Eden is very similar to Mesopotamia traditions, especially Adapa and the paradise-like land of Dilmun. There was paradise, lost immorality, and forbidden knowledge.
So this is another instance where there are shared themes and a degree of proximity in the language that suggests more that one text is kind of drawing from a shared sociocultural matrix than that it's drawing directly from that other text. So Adapa would be one iteration of a tradition that finds its way into a variety of different texts and stories and narratives, and the Garden of Eden is another iteration from another time period where they're drawing from Mesopotamian literary traditions. For more on this, my friend Seth Sanders wrote a wonderful book called From Adapa to Enoch that talks a lot about how the scribal culture of ancient Judea makes use of these traditions and these characters from the world of Mesopotamia and the other worlds around them.
All of the...
Okay, so really quick, we'll just read this again. The myth of Adapa is an ancient Mesopotamian legend from Wikipedia about a wise priest of Eridu who broke the wing of the south wing in anger. Summoned to heaven by a supreme god Anu, Adapa was tricked by his creator and god Ea into refusing the food and water of immortality, sealing human mortality. While fishing, a violent southern wind capsized Adapa's boat. Enraged, he cursed the wind and broke its wing, silencing it for 7 days. Anu demanded Adapa explain his actions in the heavens. Fearing for Adapa, Ea, the god of wisdom, told him not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, claiming it was deadly. Impressed by Adapa, Anu instead offered him the bread and water of eternal life. Following Ea's false warning, Adapa refused, losing his chance at immortality and keeping humanity mortal. The significance and themes explains why humans grow old and die while gods live forever. Highlights the complex, unpredictable relationship between gods and mankind, where even wisdom can cannot outsmart divine misdirection.
These other ancient stories were written long before the Bible was written. Even the virgin birth was not new. Ancient cultures already had stories of gods or heroes born through divine intervention.
Certainly there are a lot of stories of humans, heroes, demigods being born through divine intervention, but it doesn't seem likely to me that the story of the virgin birth of Jesus is borrowing directly from any of those. It seems to be the outgrowth of concern for the purity, the divinity of Jesus in a time period when sexual desire and sexual activity was seen as kind of problematic. And so it develops independently and, in my opinion, a bit more organically within a tradition that is trying to find ways to make Jesus sound more divine, sound less like us, sound more like God. But I could be wrong about that. There could have been something in the background that more directly inspired the story of the virgin birth, but it seems to me that it is something that develops a little more organically toward the end of the 1st century CE.
So the honest takeaway is that the Bible did not drop out of the sky. It was written by people living in a world full of shared stories, shared ideas, and shared myths.
This is absolutely the case with a lot of different stories in the Hebrew Bible, and one of the clearest ones might actually be Psalm 29, which is praising Adonai using this imagery associated with the Northwest Semitic storm deity, where we're praising the Kol Adonai, the voice of Adonai, using imagery associated with lightning and thunder and inclement weather. That's storm deity imagery. But you also have a few different locations that are referenced in the poem, and none of them are actually in Israel. They're actually further north in the territory that belonged to Baal, the Northwest Semitic storm deity. And so a lot of scholars think that this was a poem that was almost just ripped from the pages of literature that praised Baal, and they might have just replaced the name Baal with the name Adonai, or they might have recomposed it on their own and just decided to closely match what was in the source text, up to and including the locations that were part of Baal's territory and not a part of Adonai's territory to begin with. And there are a few other examples. Some of them are much clearer, some of them are much hazier, where we're probably in safer territory, concluding that this is the composition of something based on traditions and themes and tropes that were just kind of in the air. But yes, certainly the Bible did not develop in a vacuum. It was written in direct engagement with the traditions that were in circulation, either in agreement with them or to oppose them or to try to supersede them. Even within the Bible itself, you have one biblical text that is doing that with other biblical texts, is telling the same stories but telling them slightly differently because they think it serves their interest better to tell it this other way. So for instance, Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles versus 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. There are a variety of different ways this happens interior to the Bible, as well as between the Bible and the literary and scribal cultures around the Bible. And the New Testament does it as well. There are a lot of ways that the Gospels are probably riffing off of traditions associated with Greco-Roman narratives and gods and things like that. Not to the degree that Jesus was invented out of whole cloth based on these other deities, but some of the stories are probably intended to remind the hearer of, oh yeah, this happened with this other deity in a similar way, even though the story goes in a different directions or includes different themes or different lessons or things like that. So yeah, that's definitely a good way to think about how we got the Bible.
And what the Israelites did was take those stories and say, no, that wasn't their God, that was our God. So the Bible is not unique or divinely isolated as many people were taught. So if you are going to take it seriously, you need to at least be honest about where these stories came from. Lots of men writing these stories, compiling these stories, and teaching these stories to benefit their power and control over others.
So I would endorse the majority of what is said in this video. However, I think tracing it all back to power and control over others is a bit reductive and tries to dismiss it all as harmful or problematic. And the reality is that while it pretty much unilaterally was about structuring power and values and boundaries and identities in the service of the interests of individuals and groups. That's not always a bad thing. When groups are under threat of destruction or extinction, or when vulnerable groups are being oppressed or marginalized, you have to engage in attempts to structure power and values and boundaries and identities. So sometimes that can be a good thing. Sometimes it can be beneficial for the survival of vulnerable or marginalized or oppressed groups. Not always. And once groups become dominant groups, it can very easily get very problematic very quickly. But I think it does a disservice to the way that these texts have functioned throughout history to dismiss it all as about power and control over other people, because I think that labels it all as bad, and that's not necessarily a good way to understand everything that's going on within the biblical text, the relationship to other texts, and the way these texts have been utilized and operationalized and deployed.
What I always considered the Bible to be is just a basically, a kind of brought together law book to control. And when I say control, I don't mean like be the governing body, the governing thought form for a population, right? Because obviously if you have zero rules, zero laws, and everybody is just free to roam around to be their natural selves, well, there's going to be a lot of kind of craziness going on. And so that's kind of the understanding that I'm sure that he's trying to come to, is that the purpose of all of this is just that, ultimately governance is required, and, the Bible was just acting as a form of governance. And we can see that kind of like in the European, in some of the European governance forms, where the church was kind of the predominant governing force in a local region. But I'm going to go ahead and finish up this video.
Throughout history, certainly there are good things that have come from these texts and can and will continue to come from these texts, even though there are also certainly very bad things that have come from attempts to leverage these texts to structure power and values and boundaries and identities in the service of the interests of individuals and groups. I think it is relative, but overall, I think this video makes a lot of good points and a lot of good observations. And the fit for this video, what up, party people?
So that's kind of the thing that rocked my world when I was a Christian. Okay, so you see this and you ask yourself, well, then what the hell? What next? Right? How is it that I was taught that this entire system was this bulletproof system, that God divinely inspired the word? Like, I was literally taught that every single word in the Bible was was an exhale from God. It was this divinely perfect book that was written that had zero errors, zero mistranslations, and it was completely unique, and it was the story of our Creator and all this kind of stuff, And so when you see this, it becomes a question of, okay, well then what the hell? Well, what do I do now? What do I believe now, right? And you get this sense of like, okay, well, I'm just going to go to church because I enjoy going to church, because there's community, there's nice people there, all my friends are there, my family's there. But then at the same time, you sit around some of these sermons and you're just like, okay, well, I just don't resonate with that. Well, maybe not so much if you go to a church like Joel Osteen's church or something like that, but certainly if you go to a fundamentalist church, you're going to sit around some of these more dogmatic pastors and you're going to think to yourself, like, I really don't want to be here, right? And so ultimately the goal is just to find the path that fits for you, right? Everybody wears shoes. They all have their own favorite shoes. They all have their different size foot, and you just go around and try on different things until you find the one that fits right. I've found one that fits right for me. It tends to be toward more spirituality, more enlightenment teachings, and kind of a oneness structure of the entire universe and cosmos. Other people, they go to universalist churches. Other people, they go to becoming atheists. Other people, they go to becoming, kind of whatever other paths are out there, or just going to a different religion, right? They become Buddhist, or they become whatever, right? And so this is why I say that, ultimately the path, the direction that you decide to go doesn't really matter. But what's important is that as you're walking away from this kind of dogmatic idea, this fundamentalist idea, that you kind of clean yourself on the way out, right? Just kind of like Jesus said, knock your dust off before you exit the household, kind of thing, and it's kind of that same idea that you want to make sure that you're not bringing on any sort of baggage of your old religion, and allowing that to spoil any of your other beliefs that you may walk down. A couple of books that I could point you to. A good one is Waking Up by Sam Harris. It's a guide to spirituality without religion. That's a good one. Another one that you will inevitably run into is for meaning. So you can pick up the book A Man's Search for Meaning, right? And that's a little bit different, but what you'll find ultimately is that you're going to have this kind of feeling of meaninglessness, right? And it's going to sit deep with you because you're going to think, well, I judged the hell out of my sister, or I ruined the connection with my sister because she was gay, and I did this to this person because they were sinners, and I cut off this person in my life. I cut off my son because he did this, and this is seen as a sin in the Bible, but now if the Bible's not true, then I just ruined the relationship with my son for no damn reason. And all these kind of things that are going to come up for you, right? I treated my spouse in this specific way, not because I wanted to, but because this is what the Bible said was right for me. I treated my kids this way because this is what the Bible said was right, and all these things, right? And so it's kind of, it can be really difficult and hurting to kind of navigate that process. And if you need help navigating that process, you can always reach out to me. I love helping people navigate that process. Right down there is the email, desertspring111@gmail.com. And so, or you can go to my website, and in my website, I'm putting together free programs for you to kind of figure out your own way, whichever way you want to go through. But ultimately, what you're going to be bringing up is a lot of grief. And so that's kind of where I help. It's where we sit with your grief and we kind of bring everything to the surface, all the hurts, all the pains, everything that, all of your previous, well, I thought God would do this. I thought God was going to do this. I thought God was going to be there for me, all this kind of stuff. I thought God was going to support me in, judging these people and all this kind of stuff. And so if you are, you can feel a lot of pain and kind of a loss of sense of direction and things like that. And so with that being said, I'm always here for you. My email is right there. You can contact me directly right there, or you can visit my website. My website doesn't have anything where you can contact me directly. My email is the only way that you can contact me directly. And with that being said, I'd love to have a chat with you. So without further ado, guys, if you appreciated the video, please like and subscribe. If you don't interact with this video, it goes absolutely nowhere. So if you could throw a like down there, I really genuinely would appreciate it. Even if you throw some comments that don't make any sense at all, I would love to hear them, just because the video needs interactions. And so I really do appreciate that, guys. Thank you, and we will see you in the next video.